Hello viewers, 4DIYers here with another video for everyone. In this breakout video here I'll be showing you how to replace the front wheel bearings on a 3rd generation Dodge Ram 4-wheel drive. I'm working with a 2006 1500 model. While I was doing the ball joints, I happened to notice clicking in the wheel bearings, so they are coming to the end of their lifespan. It's apart now, so it's best to replace these to save on the extra work after. Worn wheel bearings can cause excessive growling, you can feel roughness when rotating it by hand, and they can also cause an ABS fault. I do have a video for what it sounds like to have a faulty wheel bearing, so be sure to check that out. Start by safely elevating the front of the vehicle and remove the wheel. Next is popping out the center cap. This is the easiest way to loosen the axle nut. Reinstall the wheel, then lower it onto the ground. This will prevent the wheel from spinning when loosening that nut. Using a 35mm socket with a Johnson bar, loosen that axle nut. Raise the truck again and then remove the wheel. Loosen the master cylinder reservoir cap to help bleed off any pressure in the system. Loosen the two 21mm bolts holding on the caliper and carrier. Compress the pistons in the caliper using large interlocking pliers. Finish up removing those two bolts. Remove the caliper assembly and tie it off to the frame using a bungee cord. Do not hang the caliper by the rubber flex line, as this can cause damage. The rotor on this side was rusted to the hub. Using a ball peen hammer, hit it in between the wheel studs. This will help break the rotor free. Do not hit it anywhere else on the rotor, as it can cause damage to the rotor, potentially requiring a replacement. The tie rod has a slightly different style than what is typically found. It has a reusable clip based on what was supplied with this specific brand. They were replaced recently, therefore I have to be extra careful not to damage them. I used a hammer to give them a hit, with the nut still flush on the threaded portion. I removed the fender liner in order to gain access to the ABS sensor wire. The wheel liner is held on with a couple 8mm bolts. Once the fasteners have been removed, then push the fender liner down towards the frame, and you'll be able to unclip it from the top around the fender. After that is pulling it straight out. As for disconnecting the electrical connector for the ABS sensor, there will be a red clip which needs to be pulled out. A standard screwdriver is best for this. Once it's been pulled out, then pull the connector apart. Some wiggling may be needed in order to assist in the separation. A standard screwdriver can be used to pry up the clip to disconnect it from the opposite side. Remove a nut for the upper ball joint. In this case it was a Stover nut instead of a castle nut, so there's no cotter pin that needs to be removed. A hammer can be used to hit the stud upward for disconnecting the taper on the ball joint. This ball joint will be replaced, so I'm not worried about any damage. Watch for any tension on that upper control arm when it disconnects. Again, the lower ball joint doesn't have a castle nut either. The threaded stud was spinning, so a ratchet and a socket were required while using a wrench to remove the nut. Finish up removing that half shaft 35mm nut. And finally is removing the steering knuckle. Pull the axle shaft out, make sure the joint doesn't come apart. Now is a good time to check your CV joints too. I felt this one was dry, so I did replace the grease. That'll be saved for another video. Using a wire brush, clean up the exposed threads on the 3 bolts holding on the wheel bearing. Apply some penetrating oil to the exposed threads to make the disassembly easier. By far the easiest method I found is using an impact on all 3 of these 18mm bolts. From what I can see, they have remains of red thread locker, therefore they are extremely hard to remove by hand. The use of a propane torch is another option. I did have an issue with one of the bolts, and didn't want to damage the threads, therefore I did use a propane torch towards the end. Remove the ABS wire from the retaining bracket. Set up the steering knuckle on a wood block and, using a large hammer, hit out the old wheel bearing. Eventually it'll fall out with the backing plate. If you do live in an area such as myself where I'm exposed to winter and salt, this job will be a little harder. If there is any corrosion on the steering knuckle, a file is used to clean up the mounting surface for the new wheel bearing. Then I finished up with sandpaper. All 3 of those bolts were cleaned up using a wire brush and brake cleaner. Just remove any oily residue, which can cause problems for the newly applied thread locker. Place the new wheel bearing face down, install the dust shield, and finally the steering knuckle. Make a note of the orientation for the ABS sensor and dust shield. I applied a medium grade thread locker to the bolts and then installed. They are first tightened up using an electric impact. Set the steering knuckle up so you can easily get to each of the bolts. The torque specifications for each of these 18mm bolts is 120 foot-pounds or 163 Newton meters. Clip in the new ABS wire into that retaining bracket. Reinstall the steering knuckle. Install the axle spline first. Pull the spindle up to the lower ball joint and then thread on that nut. Thread on the half shaft axle nut. The lower control arm can be jacked up slightly to help push it into place on the upper control arm. Using a pry bar, pull down the upper control arm and insert the taper for the ball joint. Thread on the castle nut. The torque specifications for the upper ball joint is 40 foot-pounds or 54 Newton meters. The tie rod torque specification is 45 foot-pounds or 61 Newton meters. And the lower ball joint torque specification is 38 foot-pounds or 52 Newton meters. Install the cotter pins for the upper ball joint, lower ball joint, and tie rod. Clean the rear of the rotor for any rust or debris so we don't have any runout. Then install the rotor onto the hub. Install the brake caliper with carrier. Thread on the 21mm bolts. The torque specifications for the caliper carrier bolts is 130 foot-pounds or 176 Newton meters. Reconnect the ABS sensor. A cable tie did hold back the wire from any moving components, and this same method can be used again. The fender liner can then be reinstalled. Push it in as far as you can on top of the frame rail, and then tuck it back on top of the fender. My wire wasn't clipped in anywhere, but I can assume the hole towards the bottom of the fender liner is where the tree style for clip clips into for the ABS wire. Install the retaining bolts for the fender liner. The wheel can then be reinstalled. The torque specifications for the lug nuts is 135 foot-pounds or 183 Newton meters. Once that wheel has been lowered onto the ground, the half shaft nut is then torqued to 185 foot-pounds or 250 Newton meters. The center cap is then snapped back into place and you're officially done on this side. Now moving on to the opposite side for additional angles. Safely elevate the wheel and use a jack stand. Remove the wheel and then remove the center cap. Reinstall the wheel and then tighten down the lug nuts. Then lower the wheel back onto the ground. Using a 35mm socket with a Johnson bar, loosen that axle nut. Make sure the reservoir cap is still loose. Remove the wheel and then continue on with the brakes. If you wish, you can angle the wheel out slightly to gain better access to those caliper bolts. Using a 21mm socket, remove the 2 caliper bolts. Pull off the caliper and carrier assembly, then tie it off using a bungee cord. Remove the rotor and place it somewhere safe so it won't come in contact with any oil or grease. Remove the cotter pins in the upper ball joint, lower ball joint, and tie rod. You'll need pliers for this. Then remove the castle nut. The castle nut can be installed back onto the threaded stud and ensure the face is flush with that threaded stud. Using a hammer, hit the tie rod upward. With this being flush, this will help prevent any potential damage to the threads. Finish removing that 35mm axle nut. To make sure the spline isn't stuck in place, use a brass or lead hammer to hit the tip. Brass or lead is soft, therefore it won't damage the threads of the axle. Another option is making the nut flush with the outer threaded shaft and using a regular ball peen hammer. This is a similar method to what I used on the tie rod. Remove the nut on the upper ball joint. Using the appropriate size sockets, loosen the upper ball joint, tie rod, and lower ball joint. Socket sizes will vary depending on which brand of components are used. Using a ball joint separator, separate the upper ball joint from the steering knuckle. There is tension here, so it will pop back once it's released. Be mindful of this. A pickle fork can also be used, but keep in mind you'll most likely damage the boot. Unfortunately, my ball joint separator wasn't large enough to pop off a lower ball joint. The tool specific for this job was on back order for about 6 months, so I decided to modify my ball joint separator. I made short extension arms for the separator to help widen up the jaws. I also used the assistance of a lead hammer on the lower ball joint threaded stud. This is an aluminum steering knuckle, so I do not recommend hitting it with a hammer as you can cause damage. Remove the steering knuckle. I do have tutorial videos for the upper and lower ball joint replacements, so if you need more information on that, be sure to check them out. Again is cleaning up those exposed threads with a wire brush and apply some penetrating oil. Using an electric impact with an 18mm socket, remove the 3 bolts. Using a hammer, remove the old wheel bearing with the spindle assembly. Use a file to clean up any corrosion or debris, which may cause the new wheel bearing not to sit properly. Finish up with sandpaper and wipe away any dust. The bolts are then cleaned up with a wire brush, and brake cleaner is used to wash away any oil residue. Medium grade thread locker is applied to each of these bolts. Again, that wheel bearing is set facing down. Install the dust shield on the back side and then the steering knuckle. Install each of those bolts. Then tighten. The torque specifications is 120 foot-pounds or 163 Newton meters. Next was installing the steering knuckle. First the axle was pushed back into the wheel bearing, and then the lower ball joint was connected. The castle nut was then installed by hand, so everything is held into place. The lower control arm was jacked up slightly to put some weight on, so it's easier to connect the upper control arm. The axle nuts are technically required to be replaced, however I did reuse mine and applied some medium grade thread locker. The nut was then ran up with the impact. It'll be properly torqued after. Due to the tension on the bushings, you'll need a pry bar to pull down that upper control arm onto the steering knuckle. I used the coil spring for this as a leverage point. Then install the castle nut by hand. Finally, the tie rod was then put back into place. Now the torque specifications for each of those nuts. The upper ball joint torque specification is 40 foot-pounds or 54 Newton meters. The tie rod is 45 foot-pounds or 61 Newton meters. And finally, the lower ball joint torque specification is 38 foot-pounds or 52 Newton meters. Install the cotter pin for the ball joint castle nuts. Tighten the nut further to align the holes. Do not loosen the nut to align the holes for the pins. Next was installing the rotor. The back side of the rotor, which mounts against the hub face, was cleaned with a wire brush to reduce any chance of runout. The hub assembly is new, so we don't have to worry about cleaning it to remove any rust. If you are reusing the old ones, then clean them up with a wire brush as well. Install the caliper with the carrier assembly and pads. The torque specifications for the caliper carrier bolts is 130 foot-pounds or 176 Newton meters. The wheel then can be reinstalled back onto the vehicle. The torque specifications for the lug nuts is 135 foot-pounds or 183 Newton meters. The wheel is then lowered onto the ground, and as a last step, that half shaft nut is then torqued. The specification for this is 185 foot-pounds or 250 Newton meters. Then that center cap is installed back onto the wheel. It just snaps into place. New videos released every week on my channel. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button. It's a huge help to me, and leave a comment below if you found this tutorial helpful. If you're not a subscriber, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching.